of design that you see in modern cities, for example, are associated with worse mental health in inhabitants. There's a study recently that showed that certain.
Welcome to Untitled Planning. I'm Sammy, and alongside me is Alex. We are the hosts of this interview and platform.
And today, we're thrilled to have Dela Farzanfar, a Ph.D. candidate in psychology at the University of Toronto, joining us. So welcome, Dela. So Dela's research delves into the neurocognitive aspects of human creativity and its impact on well-being. She's also a registered psychotherapist in Ontario, committed to enhancing mental health access. So with a background in architecture and neuroscience, Dela brings a unique perspective to her work as a junior fellow at Massey College and a graduate fellow at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. So welcome. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
So first question, Dela. How are you doing today? Well?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited.
That's good. So you have a background in architecture, neuroscience, and psychology. Can you tell us more about yourself and what inspired your journey into the intersection of neuroscience and city building?
For sure. I've always been curious as a child, even about how certain spaces made me feel good and safe, and other spaces made me feel like I wanted to run away or they were just boring. So I began my educational journey in architecture. I wanted to be an architect. I did finish my degree in architecture and worked for a year, but throughout the experience, I realized that I'm more interested in the impact that spaces have on our mood and cognition than building buildings. And that led to me pursuing a career in neuroscience and later clinical work.
Exciting. And you currently told us, or today you just told us, you have a new blog on Psychology Today. Do you want to talk a bit about that and how that came to be?
Sure. That blog was created as part of a project that I'm involved with through the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. It's a knowledge mobilization project. And the goal of the blog is to translate research from neuroscience, psychology as it relates to perception of space, to inform policy and design decisions for urban planners or any stakeholders, decision makers, and so on.
Awesome. This is the article?
Oh, great. You brought it up.
Yeah.
That's the first blog post. Yes. Hopefully there'll be many more.
Many more. This is amazing. Do you want to talk a bit about this blog post, or you want to save that for later? You can save it for later.
Well, I can just tell you a little bit. It will involve some of the things we're going to talk about. But yeah, let's save it for later.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. No worries.
Awesome. And so you touched on, this idea of how spaces make you feel. And so that's, ultimately the topic for today is how do cities and spaces impact people? And,
that's a really good question.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
That's a good question. It's a complex one. They impact us on multiple levels. So from the macro level, cities, for example, we know that how street networks are designed impact mobility patterns, how we move, how we interact socially. When spaces allow you to stop on your path or your journey to talk to other people or to enjoy a vista, beautiful scenery, you would stop, and that creates opportunities for interactions with others. So in little and big ways, design of spaces impact our behavior. On a larger level, as I mentioned, the cities themselves as complex systems, they are encoded in our brains. What I mean by that is we can develop internal mental representations of large scale spaces like cities in our mind. There was a urban theorist, his name was Kevin Lynch. He wrote this book called Image of the City. And in the Image of the City, he talks about what makes the city legible. And he says that it's one where the inhabitants of the space can recognize the elements that make up the overall image of that city. And we are connected with one another in the same space to the degree with which we share that mental image of our shared space.
That's really interesting. So that collective, that collective memory, that collective understanding of a space is what, I guess connects us to one another as well.
Exactly. So that's one of the first ways in which cities can impact our social fabric.
Mm-hmm. And so your research also focuses on the neurocognitive aspects of human creativity and well-being. So we want to understand more about why is that important, and then how is that particularly relevant to people who are listening as well.
For sure. So I mentioned a little bit about mental models of the environment. That aspect of how cities impact our behavior relates to memories and abstract concepts. On the other hand, we have aesthetic qualities of spaces that impact us on a more kind of scene level, smaller scale. We like environments that are beautiful, that are cognitively enriching, that arouse our curiosity. And architects and designers from many years ago across different cultures knew that they could use certain principles or rules to create environments that humans enjoy being in and interacting with. We've lost that a little bit in modern cities, in post-war architecture, because those buildings were built based on the principle of form follows function, and embellishments, decorations of any kind, or any details that gave character to a building were discouraged. And right now we are at a point where psychology is looking back at aesthetics. We're trying to understand what makes something beautiful from a scientific perspective. How can we study beauty in a systematic way, and how that can inform creation of products and design of buildings. And we're just beginning that. I was able to contribute one of the studies that started this path towards empirical aesthetics, and I'll be happy to tell you a little bit more about that study as well.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yes,
before you do, can you kind of define what something cognitively enriching be? Like, what would that be for the average person?
Yeah, maybe I can draw from the example of rodent studies. So neuroscientists studied this in mice, and what they did was they created environments that had lots of toys, lots of colors, things that the rats could play with, and created interesting environments. So some rats were raised in these enriching environments, and others were not. Were just given food and water and nothing else. Their environment was boring and bland, kind of similar to some of our suburban environments. And they found that being raised in those enriching environments actually helps these rats develop better cognitive abilities. They can navigate better. They can do tasks better. So in the human sense, maybe I don't know for sure, but I would translate into being in environments like you've been to maybe some of the European cities that have strong heritage presence. Those environments like Roman architecture, Baroque architecture, the ones that were built with certain aesthetic principles in mind. As soon as you enter these buildings or these environments, you notice something. It's like the space is speaking to you. You feel something, and that's the intuitive part that science is now trying to understand. And that is the intersectionality between neuroscience and city building and design that is in a revolutionary state, I guess.
Interesting. Do you want to go into the article that you were just talking about?
So in this article, and I can show you some images maybe at some point, or pull it up and show you later.
I can pull them up if you want. Where can I find these images? Or maybe you can send me the link and we can pull them up. Meantime, let me fix my camera. We were just talking about a article that helped create this movement within, how would you say, it's like creating spaces for function and not allowing it to follow the space. Is that kind of what you were saying? Or if you want to,
this one,
how would you simplify it? What would a simple line be?
Yeah, so this article is briefly looking at the concept of beauty, aesthetic experiences, and how can we quantify this phenomenon. So briefly, we looked at images of various types of scenes, from city architecture to landscapes to mountains, and we wanted to see what are the combinations of contours, which are the lines that make up the outlines of various shapes in a scene, in an image. What combinations of those features would make that image seem more beautiful to someone? They would like it more. So this image that you pulled up is from that paper, and this is showing how we extracted different properties of these contours, so their orientation, the length, curvature, junctions. And once we did that, we put those into a model that would predict the aesthetic liking for each image based on those features. But before we could get that, obviously we had to show these images to a large group of people and ask them, how much do you like this image, rated from a scale of 1 to 5. Got those scores. So for each image, we had multiple ratings. We averaged them up, and we had a score for each image. Yeah, so you can go to the next figure, figure 2, for example. You had it down there. Exactly. And here, we put those features that we had extracted from the images as predictors in a random forest model. And we wanted to predict the aesthetic. Oh, yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Talking too much.
No, continue. I just messed up the image, but continue.
Okay. So so what you're seeing on the right is the contribution of different properties of these contours to aesthetic judgments. So you see some of them, for example, T junctions carried the most weight, and there were other features, and we have these on the left side, little schematics of what these orientations were, for example, or the lengths, to just make it easier. Anyway, so once we had those, we were able to come up with a statistical model of contour properties and aesthetic judgments. And
is this the model?
Based on this model, this is one of the trees in the random forest algorithm, and what the tree is a simple decision-making tool. So it starts with the top T junctions and asks whether the image has any T junctions and how much of them exist in that image. If it's less than the number that's on the top, then the decision-making tree goes to one direction. If it's not, it goes to the other. And then it asks about another feature. And in this way, it follows this line to get to a prediction at the bottom for how much that feature contributed to the aesthetic value of that image. This was done 1,000 times. So we had 1,000 trees in this forest, and we got the average of all those to come up with a robust estimate.
Now, my question is, what's a T junction?
Yeah, good question. T junction, junction in this sense is the intersection of lines of lines in the image. So say if you can scroll,
so all these
maybe not all of them, but let's say the office building, you have a vertical line meeting a horizontal line, or any of these ones. Yeah.
Okay.
So in that drawing, for example, in that intact long drawing on the left, anytime a line meets another one, that creates a point of contact. That's a junction. A T-junction kind of does look like a T-junction, where it's like that.
Like intersects?
It intersects, yes. And there is other kinds of junctions as well, which if you go to the first or second picture, yeah, you see on the second picture where there's a red circle, or there too, yeah, in that image you can see different kinds of junctions. The T one actually looks like a T in the middle panel.
Oh, yeah. Okay, like this one. Got you. Okay.
Yeah, and there's Y junctions and X junctions and so on.
Got you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's really interesting. So you're looking at the different line intersection within the within the environment people can perceive, right? Like what people can see, and then what those lines are, you categorize them with like different names, like like functions and junctions.
So junctions are one of those properties that we're looking at. The other properties are the orientation of the line. How much angle does it have? How long is it? How curvy is it as opposed to angular? And these are all things that we perceive in the environment when we're looking at the scene. So these all went into the model for each image, and we try to use them as predictors of aesthetic value for that image.
Interesting.
And
what does
that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That's really cool. So I'm curious, how did you come up with that kind of analysis?
I worked with Professor Dirk Bernard Walter. He's a vision scientist. And in his lab, we developed this toolbox called the Mid-Level Vision Toolbox, which is a set of software that were developed to extract these contours from real-world images. So the first thing that the algorithm does, it takes the image, traces the lines to create just the line drawings of the photograph, and then applies other algorithms to extract these properties from the lines. This toolbox is freely available, and it can be used by researchers or anyone else who's interested in looking at properties of images. I'll put the link here, but it's called mlvtoolbox.org. That's the address to use that toolbox.
Gotcha. I'll open that soon. Some couple other images. And so here I see color statistics. How did color play into the...
Yeah, so we added color as well, and try to repeat the experiment with not just one set of people, but others. And once we had this solid kind of model, statistical model based on a lot of different properties, we showed, if you go to the next image. Yes, this one, perfect. Once we had that model, what we did was we took the image and tried to find the lines, the contours that would have the highest aesthetic value and ones that would have low aesthetic value. So in this image, the red ones have high aesthetic value and the blue ones have low aesthetic value based on the model. Then we modified the image to create two versions of it. One version that only included the high aesthetic value contours, and one that only included the low aesthetic value contours. If you scroll down a little bit, you see them. So yeah, exactly. You see those two images on the right? They're on the original, but now they're predicted to be be most liked or least liked. And to test that, we actually showed these images to groups of people and asked them, which one do you like more? And we found that across all the images, across the different categories of images, and people from around the world, they liked the ones that contained the high aesthetic value images. So this confirmed our hypothesis that we probably can come up with these not universal, but these principles that most people, if applied to images, most people will find that image beautiful.
Interesting.
And
these are just a couple more.
It was repeated again with an additional set of features, ones that were kind of were a little bit higher level. So this time, for example, we included something like symmetry, or how close the lines were, not just their individual lines properties, but how they were situated close to other lines around them. Repeated the experiment again, and we found the same results. This was one of the studies, actually the first study. This was the first study that showed a causal link between contour properties and aesthetic value, meaning it was the first study that showed that if you take these properties of these lines, you manipulate them in particular ways, you can make people like or dislike an image based on that.
Really
this paper, thank you. This paper was published in Psychological Science. I worked with my professor at U of D. His name is Professor Dirk Brennel-Walter. I think I mentioned that. And we were the co-authors of this paper that was published in Psychological Science in 2023.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Thank you.
Interesting. That's like really, really cool. I don't think. One second. Resume. It's really interesting because I don't think 90% of the people, like 98% of the people, I don't even think I consider this myself, that the lines themselves of what create the spaces around us has an impact on us. Because I think about the form of space, like you talked about Kevin Lynch's, he has the form of space and stuff. And so I've considered that quite a bit. And it's really interesting because the average person doesn't even consider that, right? Like I had to be taught it, and I was kind of nurtured in that environment a bit. And so I was fortunate to even be aware of it when I was a bit younger. But the lines themselves seem to have, like, what would you say the significance is on like someone? Yeah.
That's a really good question. We knew from previous research that these perceptual qualities of environment, they impact how we categorize objects and how we recognize objects. So they play an important role for basic vision tasks. But this study showed that they go beyond that, and they have an impact on something as subjective as how much you think you like something, which is more subjective and more emotional, right? They have an impact on our affect. This actually reminds me that there was a study that's from the same lab that looked at the impact of these contours on mood, and found interesting results as well. For example, more feelings like anger are associated with more angularity, and more calmness is associated with curvature. So there's that research that's beginning to unfold as well.
Interesting. Okay, really cool. I'm going to give you a scenario, and maybe can you give some insight on the scenario? It's kind of a question at the same time, but let's say someone is walking to work, school, or commuting every day, and they're observing the same environments, but that's not, but there's nothing really there for them to be awed by, or nothing there that's unique. And maybe there has been, but they're now desensitized by it. What kind of impact would you say that this experience that many of us live has on us?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's the thing that inspires me to talk about talk about this work, because I feel like those experiences are soul sucking in some way. You know?
For sure, yeah.
The daily commute, everyone loves it.
Yeah.
Right? In the same place that doesn't change, or like it's very boring and not cognitively enriching. We used that term before. I think those environments, those experiences do have an impact on us in a negative way. And research is now starting to show that they actually do. Certain elements of design that you see in modern cities, for example, are associated with worse mental health in inhabitants. There's a study recently that showed that certain characteristics of neighborhoods are associated with certain symptom clusters, like feelings of fatigue, loneliness, depressed mood. They do correlate with environmental design.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Yeah. Sometimes you're like walking through cities and you're like, why does this place make me want to cry? Like, why do our cities make us so sad? I'm like, what the heck?
Yeah. I have those experiences in parking lots. You know, when you're
Oh my
crossing
gosh. Yeah.
a street intersection, and at the intersection you have this gray parking lot with a really boring mall at the end of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So even just like underground parking lots, I was just talking about this with a friend the other day where I'm like, I find ourselves in these random parking lots and they're actually quite like scary, dark, like the lighting's bad, they're dark, the like just grim. And I'm just like, and you're just trying to get there as fast as in and out as fast as possible. But I'm like, and then I remember I went to one random parking lot and they actually put a mural on the inside. And I was like, okay, that's kind of nice. I appreciate that. You know, even if you're just passing by, it kind of, you know, warms you up a little bit. Otherwise it's so cold. Yeah.
Same thing with corridors in modern buildings. Have you had those experiences walking down this corridor with buildings on either side, and the corridor goes around the building, and you keep getting lost, and you keep going around and around?
Yeah. I have a question with I guess maybe, I don't know how much this has to do with like the objective space, but kind of a thing I've realized, especially living in different cities during my undergrad and my graduate school, is my commute to school, my walk to school. The first few times I commute to school or walk to school, it feels like it's forever. I'm walking for like 30 minutes. But then like later on, it feels like it's like I'm just there, you know, like it just feels like I'm there so quickly. I feel like that's something a lot of people experience. The first time you experience something feels really slow, and then over time it feels really fast. And why is that? Like, do you know why? Am I losing my mind?
With you mean navigating specifically, right? Like from getting from A to B. The first time is hard because you're trying to situate yourself in the environment. Once you've learned that map, that mental map of the space, you no longer actually need to retrieve it. You may just rely on motor memory, kind of get your relationship between your body and what you're seeing, and it's not very mental anymore at that point.
Yeah.
So it becomes like less stimulating. You almost go into like autopilot. You're just like,
exactly. Yeah.
Interesting.
Like brushing your teeth.
Yeah, it's a good question. I used to say the same thing to my mother, and she would be like, "It's because you know where you've been," which is how I guess the unpsychologist way of explaining it. But yeah, I guess that sense of familiarity. You're like, "Oh, I already know this path before." Like you're just, you know, doddling along. Okay.
Yeah. You know when people go like, or like I feel like a common thing I've been hearing a lot is like, "Oh, time has gone faster." Like it feels like time's just moving by faster. Do you think a part of that has to do with we're really just kind of now stuck in the same places over and over, and our brain is no longer stimulated, and so it just feels like things are moving quicker? Or is there like a more a better reason for it that you've come across?
Well, that's a good observation. I think we all experienced that a little bit during the pandemic, right? Because we were all in confined spaces for a long time, and we had to work and live in the same place, and these boundaries that you normally have, boundaries that separate your work and like social life from personal life, where essentially they disappeared. And what that does is it does have an impact on your memories as well, and how you separate events, and everything seems to just be one long experience. So the separation between physical spaces where you do different things is very important in how you experience life, how you encode memories, how you understand things. So the fact that we had to stay in confined spaces, I think, had to do with that. Post pandemic, we were still experiencing some symptoms of that, I would say.
I see. Yeah. Interesting. So what would that mechanism be? Like maybe it's a bit too detailed or like scientific or something, but what would that mechanism be like in simple terms? Like how would that look like within your brain? Is it just like blocking things off because it's so repetitive, or?
That's a good question. I don't know how this is impacting us on a neural level, but I know that there's a clear representation of boundaries of events. And things seem to shift around the boundaries. So when you separate memories, you know, okay, well, this thing happened in this room, and I went to the other room. The doorways, the places that separate spaces are where things get fuzzy.
Okay.
Memories get fuzzy, but you also see that in mental representations, in brain signals, where they're not as clear. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does in a way. It does in a way. I don't. It makes sense to me. I'm just trying to, because I think it's like something people always kind of experience, right? These things that people experience, and they just don't know. They don't know why. And sometimes I think people think they're like alone in the experience of feeling the specific thing, right? I don't know if it has to do with like narcissism or it has to do with just because we're by ourselves a lot. But
loneliness is real right now.
Yeah. And then there's the loneliness conversation. Yeah, I was kind of also talking just about the perceived experience that we have, right? Like just walking and we're like, oh, I didn't realize how fast this took me this time, even though the time's actually the same. So it's like, but yeah. But then there's loneliness, which we will get into. But before, a conversation in a piece that Alex and I have been talking about a lot has to do with place attachment. And so we were kind of curious, how does our emotional connection to a place influence our behavior and well-being? And is it something that can be intentionally cultivated? And what are the repercussions when this attachment is lacking?
That's a really good question. I don't think we have enough research to really say for sure what's happening. My sense is that, maybe going back to Image of the City again, Kevin Lynch, sense of place there, that's being able to have a clear picture of your environment, its essential elements, having a picture of that and sharing that picture or image with others who you interact with in a social sense is important to your well-being and sense of attachment. This relates to, I think, to some of the issues that immigrants, for example, experience when coming to new environments, and they feel they lack that sense of attachment to space. Why does that happen? I think that it happens in a different way when we talk about post-war modern North American cities than it does in Europe. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I've had that experience. When you, as an immigrant, go to a place that has architectural heritage that is preserved, you walk around, like maybe Rome or Prague or Paris or whatever, or those cities, and you recognize your relationship with that environment. That's local, and I'm from somewhere else, and the environment speaks to you with that way because it's representing a culture that you're now entering into.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a clear relationship as an outsider maybe to that environment. Like, this is Rome and this is the culture that I'm interacting with. Whereas as an immigrant who comes to North America and sees the architecture that was created to remove any sense of attachment, actually, to just serve functions, you are confused. I think I felt confused as to what is my relationship with this culture, this space. Like, what is the identity of this place? Well, it was built not to have an identity in the first place. Perhaps maybe because it was built to attract different people to that. It wanted to not have a particular identity, but that is problematic in and of itself, and we can discuss that at length.
Yeah. So you think it's more? So my follow-up question was: do you think it's done on purpose to kind of make it as unattachable, like you can't attach to the space, so the function works at a higher capacity? But now, I think you kind of touched on: are they just creating a universal canvas? Because I know in the arts, a lot of artists would paint figures, but they wouldn't paint them with a face, or they'd put a mask on the face as a universal image because they want the viewer of this painting to put themselves in this perspective. Even like Spider-Man and Batman, they usually wear masks so kids can go like, oh man, that can be me. I'm wearing a mask. And it becomes this universal image, but it doesn't really work with the city to make it as blank as possible and go and it's like, welcome new immigrants, or like welcome anyone to this completely blank canvas. Yeah.
You touched on a really interesting point, which is that you connect with that abstract idea in that painting. If the idea, the sketch, is one that is beautiful, one that is welcoming, and one that is communicating an idea that you like, then you might be perceptive to that. But I think the problem with abstractness or is different. I think the problem we have with modern architecture now is different from abstraction alone. It is lacking that initial sketch idea. So it's lacking the identity. It's not just that it is abstract or bland, but it's lacking an idea. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. It does. And I guess if you think about, no, it does make sense, actually. I'm just thinking out loud. Yeah. No, it does. It makes sense.
It's just more about efficiency. Like now, it's just to get it done. It's not about what value can this bring.
Right.
Yeah.
Abstract art, for example, still follows certain principles of art that makes it beautiful, right? Even though it is minimalistic in a way. But the same principles are not being applied to environments that were created before and up to now. And you mentioned the problem with that was functionality, or just the lack of regard for principles of design and architecture that were fundamental to human societies outside of North America. Because
it's like we spent all these years kind of reaching such like detailed architecture, right? Like we went from like almost like nothing to like we put in so much effort, and then we went back to nothing. We were like, let's just make a cave and call it a house, and we just made a box, and you're like, go inside. But like, I think about like just the images I've seen, or like when I'm from Syria, so like if you see like the old Damascus house, right? You have the courtyard in the middle. You have like the way that family interacted was very different. The architecture is very different. The city that it functions in is very different. But even here, if you go to Montreal, which is probably, I may be mistaken, someone's going to correct me. I'm a failing geographer at this point. But like Montreal probably has some of the oldest architecture in Canada. That's in the more like modern era, I guess, of Canada. And that looks completely different. Like people are in awe of Montreal architecture or like space overall, not necessarily the architecture. It's interesting how we just like spent all this time developing a craft and we just threw it out. We were just like, let's brutalist, like I don't
the like lack of ornamentation like in our buildings, I think it's a detriment to how we live in these. But like, you were talking about Syria. I keep thinking, as you were talking, I keep thinking about Athens, where like when you go to Athens, it's a city that's like, as much as it's like evolving, in a modern way, it's very much stuck in the, there's all these ancient artifacts. Like you can't, throw out a piece of paper without somehow landing on some sort of like artifact of some sort. Like you'll go into the metro and you'll go into the station and there'll literally be like a museum in the metro station, and you'll see like a body and they'll be like, this is from X, Y, and Z era. And you're like, oh, okay, interesting. And then you go deeper and then you take the train. So it's like everything you do. And I think there's funny, we're talking about how the spaces, let's say in North America, are more so focused on function. They've lost, I guess, the fun as a way of thinking about it. But I think back in Athens, you have one of the main squares is a Monastiraki, and it's like the ancient town, it preserved pretty much the way it was. But now you see in those old buildings and those old like kind of like in that old typology or ancient typology that they've kept, you have like stores that are modern, like you'll have a Sephora in there. So I think there's that funny intersection between like the old and the new, but then that particular area is where everyone congregates, whether you're like tourists, whether you're not a tourist. That's like where you'll find like kids playing, there's music, there's all kinds of things going on. So I'm like, you don't have to, let go of one for the other. If anything, they would enrich in each other if we thought about it more or were built in that way. Yeah.
I have a question, and just like a follow-up question is because we're talking about like they're designing spaces more for function, but like arguably having good architecture and good environments is for function at like as well. And so is it just a different it's a different function, but what is that function would you say that's being served? Because they're kind of taking away from it, or they're taking away from one type of function to a different type of function. I don't think that's talked about enough.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, meaning that yes, we need spaces to do activities. We have a need for spaces that we design, but that doesn't mean that they're built just to fulfill that need. We're also human beings, and we're not robots. We don't have to just do things. We also want to connect, for example, with others. I'll give you an example. For example, the example of a corridor, right? If you design a corridor with one long hallway and have rooms along the side, that's the most efficient way that you can design a space so that a person can get to, as many people as possible can have offices or rooms and can get to their respective spaces using a common hallway. So that's functional, right? That fulfills the function. But what it does is it's saying actually all you do is you come to this space to get to your own environment. It doesn't allow you to stop and talk to someone, because if you stop at the hallway, this is going to block the way, for example. Someone else is coming by. It's just uncomfortable. But you can design the same thing, but have breakout areas where people can stop by. Maybe there's a window at the breakout area and the light comes through. And when you're walking down the corridor, you see that. Oh, maybe then that space is a place where I can stop by and chat with one of my colleagues. In that way, in that simple way, a space can create opportunity for connection. And it's telling you, you can do something other than just get to your place, which is function. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I agree with you. I think that's important to be considered. I think it's just like the focus on building efficiency and just like not spending that extra month or an extra whatever. And I think cost too. It's probably more cost efficient not to focus on having nice spaces or like visually and emotionally functional spaces.
And I would argue that cost saving that we have done, let's say, by creating those kinds of environments, have led to more spaces or the way we're designing buildings and spaces are impacting us negatively. So in the long term, it's not good for us. It's not cost effective.
Yeah. It wasn't calculated, right? I always say, like, people are like, human beings we're terrible at forecasting things. Like, like we considered all these things, but then probably no one considered mental health. They probably just considered just like general enjoyment. Then the whole like mental health crisis is very different.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I suspect they might have, but they just didn't care. Some people. Yeah.
I'm sure some like philosopher was like.
You're exactly right, Alexander. I think that we're picking up on the fact that the designers or the architects in a societal way of this type of architecture, we're not thinking about us as human beings. We're thinking about of us as these wheels in a machine, maybe a capitalist system, and where we have to kind of just fit into that and work and make profits. But what we're picking up on is probably that idea that we talked about earlier. The idea is you being a worker, but not needing other things to thrive, perhaps.
Perhaps. Yeah.
Gonna throw that in, okay, but and we kind of segued into the next question we have. Is about like you as a practicing psychotherapist in Ontario. Drawing from academic. Okay. So, as a practicing psychotherapist in Ontario, drawing from your academic experience, what insights can you share about the rise of urban isolation and loneliness? And we touched on bits and parts of it in our conversation, but any other thoughts you have?
Yeah, I'll be happy to chat about that. I mentioned earlier that now there's more research coming up showing that there's a relationship between urban living and worsened mental health. We are unhappier in cities, and in particularly cities with particular characteristics: lack of green space, lack of sunlight, certain street network topologies, and so on. They're all contributing to symptoms like depression, anhedonia, anxiety, fatigue, and increasing the mental health burden in cities and urban environments. Obviously, it's not just the physical space alone that's contributing to that. There are societal factors, there's economic factors, for sure. But I think that space is a big factor. And as a psychotherapist, I am concerned about the ability of individual therapists being able to meet the demands of today's crisis. And I think for that reason, there's something that has to be done on a macro level, kind of like therapy at a mass scale, through the design of cities and environments, like incorporating beauty, aesthetics into our everyday spaces, things that we interact with, and from that to creating interventions in therapy that use our highly evolved spatial cognitive system to resolve mental spaces, things that happen in mental spaces, which is another big topic, maybe that has to be discussed with a different episode.
Sure. So, like, to take preventative manners rather than trying to set out all the fires. The fires being everyone's mental health.
That's the first part. Yes.
To prevent it. That's really. It's just like such a weird, unfortunate situation, because it's almost every single one of planning problems, like planning within the problems within the planning world or the cities and amongst people, is almost a lot of them are preventable. But rather we focus more on trying to set, like, putting on band-aids, and addressing the pain points rather than preventing the pain points, and taking more preventable actions usually yield greater outcomes, right? Like greater fruit. I don't know. I don't
Rewards,
know what the saying is.
Yeah.
Greater rewards. Yeah.
On a positive note, this is a time when we have an opportunity. These buildings that were built after World War II are starting to need renovations, resurfacing in the city. For example, city like Toronto, they're undergoing that. So now is a chance where we can create a new image, if you will, for our city by making builders and developers and planners accountable in terms of the impact that their design decisions have on our mental health and well-being, and making sure that they are aware of emerging evidence from psychology and neuroscience talking about the impact that these decisions can have, but also what are some ways that they can design better environments. And this can happen by engaging in conversation with people who are doing this kind of work or beginning to do this kind of work. So I'm hopeful. I think we have an opportunity now because those buildings are so old and we can't move them from the ground, but we can change the surfaces at least. That will also hopefully help immigrants or people who came in after that period into the city feel like they can see themselves in the environment and have that place attachment developed more.
It's also Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just I have all these spontaneous questions and they're like putting me on the spot. I'm thinking like, what are there's like heritage buildings in Canada, even though Canada is like 10 years old, 100 years old, whatever. And they try to preserve them. They preserve the facade of the buildings. Some of these buildings are just like red brick, and like they might have some history, but architecturally, aesthetically, they're whatever. They can probably demolish it and save more money from like not preserving them and really emphasize on like creating brand new beautiful architecture, right? Some of them that there are preserving are like worth to be preserved, right? But I just like, what are your thoughts from that? Maybe it's a hot take. I don't know.
Yeah, my intuition is that there's a lot more that we can do in terms of creating guidelines and creating incentives for new buildings, for construction of new buildings or renovations of these, for example, apartment buildings that were built in the 60s. There's a lot more impact that could come from focusing on that than for example, getting in the way of the designation of certain buildings as heritage. It is possible that some of them may not meet the criteria for physical reasons, but there may be social reasons why a particular place is designated as historic. Perhaps it was a community space for a marginalized group during a difficult time. We don't know what the elements of consideration are beyond the physical aspects of the space that led to that designation. But I wouldn't focus on that. So I would focus on construction of new buildings and figuring out how to renovate the old ones that were built in that particular style in a way that would help us enjoy our environments more.
Great.
And so building off of, we touched on it here and there, but when we last spoke and in this conversation, we touched briefly on the urgency of this topic, particularly in helping folks understand the importance of considering immigrants' experience in urban environments. So, and you touched on it already in this conversation, but I just want to open that box more because there's so much to say, but like, how does your research address, or help folks in learning how to address the needs and experiences of diverse communities coming to these cities? And what can we do to build that place of attachment that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think it's a very important issue to be considered from both people who are doing neuroscience/psychology research, also from the other side, designers and architects. There's not a lot that right now we do to incorporate those perspectives, but I think as an immigrant myself, when my family immigrated, I was a teenager, and I was trying to kind of learn about the environment that I was in by looking at the buildings and trying to figure out the style. What is this space about? I knew about this country and that country, and they have particular characters. And what's the character of this place, Canada? And I was trying to learn that by looking at the buildings, and I couldn't. I felt like I didn't fit in, or I didn't understand what I was trying to fit in with. So I don't think my experience may be alone. Others may feel the same way, and there should be perhaps research groups looking at that, like talking to immigrants about what kind of environments, not environments, but elements from their past could be incorporated in the new environment. There could be a political backlash about that too. Why should the space resemble anything that the past of the immigrants should resemble? But if we want to create a society that's multicultural, and we're inviting immigrants and we want them to be integrated in Canadian society, then we need to co-create a new reality of what it means to be Canadian. And that could happen through creating a different face for our cities and environments.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Dela, thank you so much. So like the final question, and then we can wrap it up. And so like, what advice would you give planners, architects, and just urbanists to kind of create more mentally and emotionally supportive spaces?
It's a good one. I hope to, at some point, come up with a very long list of things that we have scientifically tested and we know that work. I hope that will happen in the future, but we're not there yet. But for now, what I can say is two things that I've learned from the work that I've done. One is that creating environments that are memorable is key. And how that happens is by focusing on boundaries between spaces and entrances and exits, making those memorable in some way by distinctive features, by locations, things like that. Once you have distinct regions in space that are separated from one another, you will remember that environment better. You will form the mental map that will make it easier for you to navigate that space, but also feel more familiar and safe in that environment. So that's the first piece. The second piece relates to aesthetics, sense of beauty, looking at research that's being done in neuroaesthetics and empirical aesthetics to inform the design process that architects and planners go through. I think that would be important as well.
Great. How can folks learn more about you or get involved with your work? Where can people find you? All of that.
Well, I'm always very happy to talk about this topic. I'm very passionate about the impact of architecture on our mental health and cognition. You can reach me by email. I can leave my contact information with you, and I'm always looking forward to new collaborations and ideas for taking this movement to a different level.
Awesome. Thank you. Do you have any questions for us?
I'm just so thankful that you have touched on this important topic and you're doing this work. So I really appreciate it. And I really thank you for inviting me to speak here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.